Welcome back, biologists. We are covering our sixth lecture now, Metabolism and Respiration. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the camera now so we can focus on the PowerPoint presentation. So here we go, Metabolism and Respiration. Let me start off with some helpful tips for how to approach this chapter, because I think that some of you are going to find this chapter to be a little bit tedious. There's a lot of chemistry involved, and I'll tell you right now that a lot of the chemistry that your textbook goes over is kind of unnecessary. So really pay attention to this PowerPoint presentation, because I'm going to indicate here precisely what you need to know, and more importantly probably for you guys, what you don't need to know. Okay? So I don't want you to get lost in the woods and be focusing on things that are unimportant, especially for this particular lecture. Now, this is an incredibly important lecture, though. It has to do with some very basic things, like you're sitting here watching this and you're breathing, right? Every one of us is breathing right now. We're breathing in what? You're breathing in air. But you're not actually using just the air, you're using the oxygen in the air. Yeah, so you're constantly breathing oxygen. What the heck is that oxygen even being used for, right? And when you're breathing out CO2. Well, that's kind of weird. Where's that CO2 coming from? Where in your body is it being produced? How is your body getting rid of it? These are some very serious questions. Also, you probably ate today, right? And all of that food that you ate was burned up in some way, shape, or form, except for that part of it that you didn't burn up, which you passed out your body, or at least you will real soon. But you need to have energy, and that's really what this lecture is all about. It's all about metabolism and respiration, which has everything to do with energy formation and energy utilization in your body. And this is really what it all comes down to, ATP. ATP. Adenosine triphosphate, that's what ATP stands for, but you can just know it as ATP. It is the universal energy source in pretty much all living things. What does that mean? You know, we have dollars in this country, right? But if you go to some other country, your dollars may not necessarily be useful, right? You want to have their dollars when you go to other countries. And that's because money is only good in the country of its origin. Wouldn't it be nice to be able to travel around the world and use some sort of universal currency, something that everybody recognized as being valuable, and it didn't matter what country you were in, you could always barter with it. One such example would be like gold. Gold is universal. It doesn't matter whether you're in Namibia or Australia or in India. Gold, everybody understands. Okay, in your body, that's kind of an analogy. In your body, there are all kinds of processes going on. Okay, there's lots of stuff going on, and they're all biochemical pathways that have lots of different outcomes. They're creating all kinds of things. They're breaking a lot of things down, and that's expensive. It requires energy. But not just any energy. You all probably know that sugar, for example, sugar has a lot of energy in it. But there's a lot of different kinds of sugars. So we need to come up with some sort of a universal form of energy that can be used in any chemical reaction, no matter what. And that universal form of energy is ATP. As long as you have an ATP molecule, you can make pretty much any reaction go. Okay, so where does ATP come from? Well, it's energy, but where did the energy that is stored up in ATP come from? Well, it came ultimately from the sun. Okay, what do I mean by the sun? Well, I'm bringing up a term here that looks kind of long, photoautotroph. Photoautotrophs are organisms that convert sun energy into ATP. So let's break this word down. Photo refers to light. Auto means to do it by yourself. And troph means to eat. So photoautotrophs are organisms that absorb light, in this case sunlight, to by themselves store energy in the form of ATP. And from a photoautotroph's perspective, they can actually use that ATP to make sugars. And they basically make sugars to store up that energy for later. That's their way of storing energy for later, is to make sugars and then store those sugars. What's a typical photoautotroph? A plant, a tree, a shrub, grasses. These are all examples of photoautotrophs, photosynthesizers. Okay, this is going to be a topic for another lecture. Photosynthesis is going to be its own lecture. Now, what about animals? We're not photoautotrophs. We can't use sunlight. So instead, we convert food energy, what we put into our body, and we burn that, and the energy we get out of that food, we put into making ATP so that we can use that ATP for all the myriad of functions that happen in our body. So ATP actually drives metabolism. Now, I want to draw us back to the macromolecules lecture that we had before. We were talking about all the different macromolecules. You remember the carbohydrates, the lipids, and the proteins. And we had mentioned we were going to go over that fourth variety, the nucleic acids, unto themselves. And DNA is actually made up of nucleic acids. And that's why, since DNA is so important, we were going to have a DNA lecture unto itself. But one other nucleic acid variety is ATP. ATP actually is a nucleic acid. It has the 3 components that make it a nucleic acid. This is just a callback, by the way, to the past lecture. You've got a sugar here. This ring right here is actually a sugar. The sugar is called ribose, and it's connected up here to a base. In this case, the base is called adenine. And then over here, you have your phosphate group. In this case, it's 3 phosphates that are all kind of chained together. So you've got your sugar, your base, and your phosphate group. Now, I could imagine a test question on the midterm asking you for the various components that make up a nucleic acid, and you'll go, oh, I know that. These 3 things right here make up a nucleic acid. The base, the sugar, and the phosphate. All right. Now, what do we use ATP for? Well, we use it to do work inside the cell, don't we? And this is kind of the general chemical reaction that occurs inside of all cells in your body. You need to basically release energy in order to form ATP, and the energy release part of this is usually in burning a sugar. The act of burning a sugar releases energy that you can then store up into ATP. And that ATP can then get used for energy requiring reactions like building proteins or building hormones or whatever it is. Whatever your body needs to do cellular work, it can only use ATP. Remember, that initial sugar that you started with over here, yeah, it's got energy, but all of this stuff down here can't use pure sugar. It can't understand using pure sugar. It can only use ATP. So you have to burn that sugar, use the energy that's released in it in order to form ATP. And so we have names for these kinds of these parts of the reaction. Here's an organism that's eating, right? It's bringing in food items that can be burned. This one happens to be a piece of bread, so lots of starch, which eventually will break down easily into sugar. And that's called an exergonic reaction. Exer meaning like releasing. So exergonic means that you're eating food, you're breaking it down, you're burning that food, releasing the energy to put into ATP, and then you use the ATP for what's called an endergonic reaction. Ender means to build up or to create. So it's a reaction that allows you to build things with. So you're storing up complexity right here. Now, even though you are burning stuff here and you're building stuff here, the overall reaction is still exergonic. It's still a negative endeavor. You're still burning more than you're making. And you know that because if you just hold your hand up to your forehead, you can feel your temperature, right? It's because as you're continuing to do this reaction throughout your body, you're also giving off heat. And since you're releasing heat in the process of also making all of this other stuff, then it's overall an exergonic reaction. As you're releasing heat, it's obvious that not all of the energy that's being burned from your food is going into making stuff. Some of it is going into creating heat. So that's why we say even though we're making stuff, the endergonic part of this, overall it's still exergonic. There's still going to be some loss of energy. And that's true of just about anything in chemistry. Now, because of that, this squirrel actually doing work. How about that? It's a working squirrel. He's having fun. Now, chemical reactions. Here we have our adenosine triphosphate, our ATP. And how do we get the energy out of this ATP to actually do work? Well, what we do is we break off the terminal phosphate bond, just breaking that off, and we turn it from adenosine triphosphate, tri meaning 3, to adenosine diphosphate, or 2 phosphates. And in the process of breaking this phosphate off, the energy that gets released can then be used to do some work. Ultimately, it has to do with building stuff up, and this is why ATP works. Remember that we're trying to actually build things up. We're trying to create macromolecules from the raw materials that we eat and break down. And that's an endergonic reaction. You need to have ATP to drive endergonic reactions. It's the only way to do it. And so it does this, it achieves this through a process called phosphorylation. Phosphorylation is all about transferring that broken off phosphate and applying it to another molecule. And in the process, it looks kind of like this. This is just a diagrammatic way of looking at it. Let's say this is a little machinery here in our cell membrane, and the whole purpose of this machine is to help certain products move through the cell membrane. The only way that you can do this is if you apply some energy to it. Where are you going to get that energy from? From ATP. So ATP comes along, it phosphorylates, it gives up that phosphate, attaches it to this little doorway, and voila, it opens that doorway and releases the product. So that's an example of an endergonic reaction. You phosphorylate this little machine, you drive it until you've used it up, and it releases stuff. Then you have to start over. If you want to do this again, it resets itself, and then you have to burn another ATP to do it. Here's just another example. We have these funny looking dyene proteins which walk along the microtubules in a cell, and they transport stuff around. This vesicle is being transported around. Well, it can't move through a cell unless it has ATP to move it. So that's what ATP is doing. It's actually moving this little motor protein. Kind of fun little reaction there. Now, regenerating ATP is necessary. If you burn up all of that ATP, that is, you cleave off all of those phosphates, well, now you have ADP. You can recycle that. You simply need to find a way to reattach the phosphate to turn it back into ATP. So your cell makes ATP by breaking down carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. You burn a sugar, and that energy that is released literally is the energy you need to reapply that phosphate and put it back onto the ADP to create ATP in the process. And this is needed. This goes on every second of every day in your body. You are having to continue to regenerate ATP. And it's achieved through a series of electron transfers. We're not going to get too heavily into tracking electrons and all of that. That's, a subject for a chemistry class. We're just going to focus on two main types of energy transfers. That's it in this section. And they are right there below: oxidation and reduction. In oxidation, a substance actually loses energy. In a reduction reaction, a substance actually gains electrons. So why is this important? Well, it's important because this is precisely why you need oxygen. Oxygen, the oxygen you're breathing into your body, helps this happen. Oxygen is the best oxidizer on the planet. It has a chemical property known as electronegativity. It happens to be very, very strongly electronegative, so it actually sucks out electrons from other substances. And it's great because there's lots of oxygen in the air, there's lots of oxygen in the water, it's all around us, and essentially what it does is it steals electrons from hydrogen-rich molecules. And I want you to think back to carbohydrates and to lipids. These are large macromolecules that have lots and lots and lots of hydrogens hanging off of it. So when you expose that stuff to oxygen, the strongly electronegative oxygen, it actually strips the electrons out of these macromolecules, and that is how it changes their energy state. It uses that change in energy in order to apply to ATP, to create ATP. So this is really why oxygen is important. You need oxygen to help create ATP. Now, where does energy ultimately come from? In your case and my case, we get that energy from the food we eat. We've already mentioned that. However, the food we eat, where did it get its energy from, like the plants and the animals? Well, most of us eat plants and animals. Some of us only eat plants. Well, it's obvious where the plants get their energy. They get it from photosynthesis, from actually absorbing sunlight and finding a way to lock up that sunlight into a molecule that you can use for later, that being sugar. Okay? So what about the cow that you ate in the hamburger, or the pig or the fish that you ate? Well, ultimately those organisms also eat plants. Okay? So it's interesting that even if you consider yourself a meataholic and that's all you eat is meat, well, even the animals that you eat are relying on plants, ultimately. And so all energy available to living organisms on the planet come from the sun. Even if you're a meat eater, even a lion is going to rely on eating gazelles, and gazelles eat grass, and grass gets their energy from sunlight, right? So ultimately, ATP energy that is stored up in your body comes from energy from the sun. So let's go ahead and talk about energy production. Remember, we're going to go through this long chain of events that I mentioned in the very beginning, and I don't want you to get caught up in the details. We're just going to focus on ATP production. That's what the bottom line is here. This whole lecture right now is all about creating ATP. Now, the process may be kind of complex, but we're going to just focus on those steps in the chain that help us get to the end product of creating a little bag of ATP. Now, the first part of ATP production is known as an anaerobic pathway. Let's break that word down to understand what it means. Anytime you see an A in front of a word in science, A or an refers to not having it or being absent of it. So aerobic usually refers to requiring oxygen, like you go out to the gym and you do your aerobics, right? Aerobics means you're getting exercise by doing a lot of breathing and getting a lot of oxygen. Anaerobic is a pathway that does not require oxygen. And a long time ago, billions of years ago on this planet, there was no oxygen in the atmosphere. So we suspect that this part of the ATP production pathway, the anaerobic part of this pathway, actually evolved a long time ago prior to when there was oxygen in the atmosphere. This process doesn't need oxygen. So the oxygen that you're breathing every time, here, let me try one. Okay, I just took a breath. All that oxygen that I sucked in is not being used for the anaerobic part of ATP production. It's not going to get used until later at a second step. Now, again, we suspect that of this entire metabolic pathway, this respiration pathway of creating ATP, this is the part that ultimately was around for a very long time. It probably evolved first. It occurs in the cytoplasm of cells, and it doesn't really give you very many ATPs. It gives you some, which is better than nothing, but it doesn't give you the full complement of the entire process. The anaerobic pathway is then followed up by a second pathway known as the aerobic pathway. Aerobic, as the name implies, actually requires oxygen. You need oxygen to drive this pathway, and we suspect that this pathway actually added on to the anaerobic pathway later on. It actually evolved after the anaerobic pathway, when the planet actually, or the atmosphere, began to actually fill up with oxygen. Now, while the anaerobic pathway occurs in cytoplasm, the aerobic pathway occurs in the mitochondrion. And this one is what separates us from those organisms that can only do the anaerobic pathway, like bacteria, some bacteria, for example, because this produces a huge amount of ATP. Huge amount. So this is really an important part. And what does this suggest? What does this ultimately suggest? Well, it suggests that bacteria, those organisms that cannot do aerobic respiration, bacteria are a really good example of organisms that can only do the anaerobic part. It means that they probably were around a lot longer ago than we were. In fact, bacteria have been around a very long time, and they were around when the planet did not have as much oxygen as it does today. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with the very first step in this entire respiration chain. It all starts here with a glucose molecule. Glucose is a simple sugar. Remember, it's a monosaccharide. And you'll notice also that all the carbons, all the oxygens, all the hydrogens in this glucose molecule are loaded with covalent bonds. Covalent bonds are the bonds we talked about in the chemistry lecture that hold this entire molecule together. And in every one of those covalent bonds, there's lots and lots of energy. So if you could just break this sugar apart, you're going to get a huge amount of energy. Okay? Now, remember, we're trying to make ATP, right? We're trying to make that universal energy source. We're burning this glucose in order to achieve that. Okay, here is what the entire process of making ATP looks like in a nutshell. We have this first step over here called glycolysis. That's the first step. This is that anaerobic part that happens in the cytoplasm, the one that produces only a couple of ATP, not very many. But the products that come from this then get passed into the mitochondrion. That's what this big structure right here is. It's a mitochondrion. So the products that come from glycolysis then get pumped into the mitochondrion, where they then go through two more processes. The first process, or in this case, the second process, is called the citric acid cycle. It is a cycle that kind of continues, almost like a little motor, that actually creates two more ATP in the process. Now, the products that come from the citric acid cycle then get moved into the third and final process called the electron transport chain. It is in this process that a huge number of ATP are created. Now, you'll notice here that there are numbers next to these. 2 ATP get generated in glycolysis, 2 ATP get generated in the citric acid cycle, and 34 ATP, potentially, get created in the electron transport chain. And that's it. Where did these, or ultimately, let's see, 34 plus 2 plus 2, that's 38. It is possible to make up to 38 ATP by burning just one glucose molecule. Just one sugar molecule, just one glucose generates 38 ATP through glycolysis, citric acid cycle, and electron transport chain. So the rest of this lecture is really going to be all about tracking the products that come out of these three reactions and how they will then get used in the next reaction to generate ATP. Okay? So let's see. Step number 1, glycolysis. Glycolysis is that first metabolic pathway, again, that yields 2 ATP and only 2 ATP. Remember, this one occurs in the cytoplasm. It's anaerobic, so it doesn't require any oxygen for this one to work. You start with a single glucose molecule, and remember, that's a 6-carbon chain. It's a 6-carbon ring. And in the end, you're going to break this 6-carbon ring into 2 3-carbon rings. And this 3-carbon ring is known as pyruvate. That's just the name for this cleaved or split 6-carbon ring, which is now 2 3-carbon rings. So again, you start with a glucose, you start with one sugar molecule, you break it down in the process into 2 pyruvates. And a pyruvate is a 3-carbon chain. Okay? And in the process, you generate some ATP. So where this arrow is, that's where you're making ATP. Now, glycolysis actually requires that you spend a little bit of energy first. I know this sounds kind of weird, but this is the only part of the entire respiration process that actually requires energy to get going. You can think of it almost like a little hump. Yeah, once you get over that hump, it's all downhill and it's, you're making lots and lots of energy. But you still have to spend a little bit to get to the top of that peak before it can actually fall downhill. So in the process of of converting glucose into ATP, we first actually have to burn to ATP to get it started. And once you burn that ATP, then it starts to roll downhill. And in the process of rolling downhill, it makes 4 ATP and also 2 little funny molecules called NADHs. Now, NADH, in fact, I'm not even going to tell you what NADH stands for because I don't want you to get confused by that. Just realize that NADH, we're going to call those high energy molecules. They're just storage molecules for use in one of the later reactions. Okay? So let's look at what we're putting in and let's look at what we're getting out in glycolysis. We start with a glucose molecule. We put 2 ATP into the process, and that gets the reaction going, and the glucose then gets broken down into 2 3-carbon chains called pyruvate. And in the process of doing that, 4 ATP get created, and 2 NADHs get created for use at a later time. So this is an energy releasing step. This is glycolysis, that first part of respiration that is being spelled out here. Okay? You don't have to memorize any of these little process or any of these little intermediate steps here. And in your book, I think those are the proper pages, but in case they're not, this might be from a different version of the textbook. My apologies for that. But this step, something like this step, is going to be spelled out. You do not need to memorize the names of each of these intermediate steps. All you need to know is that you start out with glucose, you spend 2 ATP in the beginning to break it down into 2 3-carbon chains, and then in the process of allowing it to roll downhill to become pyruvate, you generate a total of 2 NADHs and 1, 2, 3, 4 ATP. Okay, does that make sense? So in order to kind of see how this happens, how it is that you're making NADHs, I actually have a little mini video. Okay, so these are what I've circled here are the things you need to pay attention to as far as the products. Okay, I have a little video which appears up on Blackboard, a very, very short little one, on how you make NADHs in this process. Okay, don't get caught up in the details there. All we have are our energy molecules that we've created, ATP, and then these high energy molecules, NADH, which will be used later. So let's see what we start with and what we end with in glycolysis. This is just a summary slide. The energy that is required, you need to invest 2 ATP up front. No way of getting around that. But the energy that's released includes 2 NADHs that are formed. Again, those are going to get used later, and 4 ATP. So what is the net yield? Take a look. When I say net yield, remember, we have to burn 2 and we get 4 out. So we spend 2, we get 4, which means our net yield is 2 ATP. That is, we spent 2, we gained 4, so we only have so we end up with 2 ATP in the end, plus those 2 NADHs. And then of course don't forget those pyruvate. At the end we end up with 2 3-carbon chains of pyruvate that will get used in the next step. Just a reminder, we suspect glycolysis evolved first. All cells do this, whether you're a bacteria or an oak tree or an elephant. Your cells all can do glycolysis, so this is why we suspect it was first. And it all occurs in the cytoplasm. Remember that there are cells, prokaryotes, that don't have nuclei, right? They don't have organelles, and yet they're able to do this right in the cytoplasm, which again demonstrates to us that glycolysis was here first, and it doesn't require oxygen. So check out the glycolysis video. I have another video up on the website which spells out just glycolysis. Watch it 10 times if you need to kind of get this straight in your mind. But again, we're really focused, I'm going to back up, we're really focused on what you put in and what you get out. That's it. Now, from this step, there's really 2 possible avenues that you can go. If you were a bacteria and you didn't have oxygen present, so let's say that one possibility is after you've done glycolysis, there's no oxygen present. So what do? Well, you can do anaerobic respiration. From that point on, and we're going to follow this pathway a little bit later, anaerobic respiration continues into a process called fermentation. Okay, fermentation is really important. This is how beer gets brewed or wine gets made, is through this pathway right here. But when there is oxygen present, then you can proceed down the full pathway into aerobic respiration. This is where we're going to go now. We're going to actually go down the oxygen present pathway. Now, an overview of aerobic respiration. Okay, this is our overview. Glucose is over here. We need the oxygen for the second part of the pathway, the part that comes after glycolysis. In the end, a whole bunch of reactions happen here that we're not going to focus on. And we spit out carbon dioxide, that's what you're breathing out, plus water. And then you get some energy. And this is what we use to make our ATP. Okay? Now, here's another way to look at this. Remember, the glycolysis part of this, that's just this top part. Remember, we have glycolysis, we have the citric acid cycle, and the electron transport chain. And right now, we've just finished glycolysis. And in glycolysis, we spent 2 ATP, we gained 4 for a net of 2, and we also created these 2 high-energy molecules, which then get used in the next process, and we have 2 pyruvate, which also get used in the next process. So now we're on to that step 2, the citric acid cycle. If you're looking this up on the internet, it's also known as the Krebs cycle. So if you wanted to look this up under some other name, don't be confused if you see Krebs cycle. They're just referring to the citric acid cycle. The pyruvate that was created by the cleaving of the glucose in the last step in glycolysis then moves into the mitochondrion. And a series of reactions continues to break down the pyruvate into two materials, a material called acetyl-CoA and CO2. This is where the CO2 that you're breathing out comes from. It comes from the citric acid cycle. And heck, that's a perfect test question. If I say something like, in what step in respiration is CO2 actually created? And then I had choices. The citric acid cycle, glycolysis, electron transport chain. You would know, oh, CO2, it's created only in the citric acid cycle. And you'd be right. You'd get that actually right on the exam. This whole process actually liberates or gives up electrons. And that's good because if you had a way to store up those electrons, well then you could use it at a later time in the energy production process. And that's really what the citric acid cycle is all about, is building up more and more and more of these high energy molecules, kind of like we did in the glycolysis section where we made those NADHs for later use. Well, we're going to do that here in the citric acid cycle also. We're going to make a few ATP, but we're also going to be creating a huge number of high energy molecules. Now, we also refer to these high-energy molecules as coenzymes. Your textbook does, so that's why I'm throwing this word up here. But these coenzymes deliver these free electrons to the next system, to the transport system. And these are known as, we've already seen NADH, so we're making more NADH in the citric acid cycle, but we're also making another class of them called the FADH2s. Again, I'm not even going to tell you what that stands for. As far as you're concerned, these two molecule types are just high energy molecules. And this is done through a whole multiple series of oxidations, which we are not going to go over the gory details of. But this is what the citric acid cycle ultimately looks like. This is the part that actually happens in the mitochondria. Remember, this is separate from glycolysis, the first part of respiration that happened outside the mitochondria. Okay, so let's start with the end products of glycolysis. Pyruvate. We've got pyruvate. We've got 2 of them. And these 2 pyruvate are going to then enter the mitochondria and then go through this whole elaborate series. First thing that you got to do is you're going to cut off one of those CO2s, which is one of these carbons here. You're just going to cleave off one of these carbons, creating a 2-carbon chain. In the process of breaking this apart, you actually generate NADH. So voila, you've just made some more energy molecules. Now this is going to come down here and combine with a 4-carbon chain to create a 6-carbon chain. So now you're back to 6 carbons. But in the next couple of steps, we're going to be cleaving off one CO2 and then cleaving off a second CO2. And in those processes of cleaving off CO2s, we're making even more high energy molecules, even more NADHs. And after this process, we then use this energy to attach phosphates back to ADP. We've created ATP at this next step. And through a further series of these oxidative reactions, we then create 2 more high energy molecules, an FADH2 and another NADH. Now this whole circle here happens with a single pyruvate entering the system. But remember, for glucose, how many pyruvate did we make? We took a glucose and we split it in half, right? So how many pyruvate is that? It's 2. In other words, the products here, you double them because this is from one pyruvate, but then there's a second pyruvate that comes from the glucose, which also passes through. So you double all of your products here. So if you were to actually add these up, and by the way, I have a video up of the citric acid cycle that you should probably follow and watch it 100 times if you need to. Here are our inputs. We start out with 2 acetyl-CoAs. We start out with all of the precursors here, but here's what's most important, what we end up with. We're breathing off 4 CO2s. We're creating 6 more NADHs. And we're creating 2 FADH2s. And we also happen to make 2 more ATP. That's great. Now, what are we going to do with these? Well, we're not going to use the CO2 anymore. That's your waste product. You're breathing that out. But these 2 high energy molecules here, the NADH and the FADH2, we're definitely going to use those for step number 3, called the electron transport chain. Another term for the electron transport chain is oxidative phosphorylation. And this process is actually where you're going to be making the bulk of your ATP. So all those high energy molecules, all those coenzymes that you created during glycolysis and the citric acid cycle, you created all that stuff. The NADHs and FADHs are now going to be used to deliver electrons. Where are we going to deliver the electrons? Well, we're going to deliver them to the inner membrane, this membrane right here, of the mitochondrion. Why are we delivering them there? Because if you deliver the electrons there, then you can actually draw, by the very fact of delivering these negatively charged electrons across this barrier, it sucks protons, extra hydrogen ions, across that barrier. That's what ends up happening as a result of this. How that happens, we're not going to focus too much on. Just accept the fact that when you have electrons flowing through a membrane, it creates a chemical condition where protons can actually pass across. Okay? So, the protons end up moving outside the inner membrane and they start building up on one side. Now, do you guys remember back to the Biology 109 lab? One of the labs we actually talk about diffusion. Anytime you build up something on one side disproportionately compared to the other, they will want to flow back across that diffusion gradient. And that's really important because that is how we are going to make ATP. We are going to force all of these protons onto one side using these NADHs and FADHs to transport electrons here into this membrane to force the protons across, build them up on one side, and then force them to flow back through this really special protein right here called ATP synthase. As they flow across, they actually create this motor which turns. And as it turns, it starts reattaching phosphates back onto ADPs, creating ATPs. It looks kind of like this. This is just the second way of looking at it. Here you have your inner membrane system within the mitochondrion. You've built up your protons on one side, and you've forced them to flow back through this ATP synthase complex, which creates ATP. Isn't that nice? So, this actually flows down a gradient, powering this ATP pump, which creates ATP. And there it is, ATP synthase. That's what that's called. So the electron transport chain, what is it really doing? It's like traveling downhill. You're spending all of this energy breaking down a sugar molecule to get up the hill. Once you get up the hill, now you can roll down the hill and in the process use all of those high energy molecules you created to now make ATP. So the electrons get passed from these high energy molecules to lower energy carriers in the membrane, and it drops in energy. The drop in energy use is what is used to make the ATP. As you drop in energy state, you create ATP. Now, the vast majority of ATP is actually created in this way. Remember, a little bit got made in glycolysis, a little bit got made in the citric acid cycle, but the bulk of ATP gets made in the electron transport chain. So, I want you to check out the videos online on electron transport. If you have to pause the video here so that you can go to those and check them out, I recommend doing that. Watch a few times. And this actually completes cellular respiration. So, really what we're going to do now is just summarize. Remember that oxygen is very, very important. If you don't have oxygen, then you can't complete the electron transport chain. And here's why. Remember how we made those electrons flow through the membrane, the inner membrane system? Well, they're going to build up too. And if you cannot have electrons building up in your cells, that's really dangerous. So what you do is you throw oxygen in there as a way to soak up the excess electrons. So oxygen actually is what helps drive this system because it helps get rid of the excess electrons. So what happens? Well, when oxygen combines with all these extra electrons, they suck up some extra protons and they form water. So that's the byproduct. You breathe in oxygen, which gets used in the electron transport chain. You breathe out CO2, which is cleaved off in the citric acid cycle, and you also create water. Water is another byproduct of this entire pathway. And in the end, you can make somewhere between 32 and 34 ATP just in the electron transport chain alone. Okay? So let's do some bookkeeping. Let's see how many ATP we actually can make. Remember in glycolysis, we made 2 ATP. In citric acid cycle, we made 2 more ATP. Now, what am I not showing you here? Okay, I didn't include the high energy molecules because those are going to get used in the electron transport chain where you can make anywhere between 32 and 34 ATP. And I'll tell you why it's 32 to 34 in just a second. But if we add these up, 32 plus 2 plus 2 is 36 ATP on average. But remember that this can actually create theoretically up to 34, which means it is possible to get up to 38 ATP in the optimal situation. Okay, that is possible. Why it's between 36 and 38? Well, I don't want to dwell on the details of that because that gets really into detailed chemistry. But here, I'll give it to you in a nutshell. When we are tracking the formation of ATP, we keep talking in terms of a single glucose molecule. You burn one glucose molecule, you send it through all 3 of these, and yeah, you potentially can get up to 38. But when we are actually tracking it in the real life, we're not measuring a single molecule of glucose. We're usually measuring a much larger quantity of glucose molecules. Okay, that's how we get this. So it's actually not exactly 36, it's not exactly 38, it's between 36 and 38. Now, this is what the process looks like in a nutshell. Let me walk you through it very, very briefly. Okay. Pay close attention to the products here. We start off with glycolysis. Remember, it happens in the cytoplasm. We take one glucose molecule, split it into 2 pyruvate. In the process, we release 2 ATP. We also create 2 high-energy NADH molecules. These then get passed all the way over here to the electron transport chain. So we'll focus on those later. The pyruvate come in and enter the citric acid cycle. A series of CO2s get cleaved off. Some ATP gets formed, but 2 more sets of high-energy molecules, a bunch more NADHs and 2 FADHs get created. And all of these high-energy molecules from both glycolysis and citric acid cycle then go to the electron transport chain, where they are used to create up to 34 ATP, somewhere between 32 and 34. So add all of these together, and this whole process of burning a single glucose molecule can generate up to 38 ATP. Isn't that amazing? Now, this is a really efficient system that has evolved over the many millions of years. It's about 40% efficient. That's actually really good when you consider that the best car that we can make is only about 25% efficient when burning gasoline, that is. So isn't that neat? All right. So that is aerobic respiration in a nutshell. Now, I want to remind you about that stop sign that I had shown you before. Remember that one pathway that you could go was aerobic. Well, what about that anaerobic pathway? Well, that's where we get into fermentation. And that's where we're going to go right now. So remember that there is the possibility of trying to do respiration in the absence of oxygen. And so what do we get? Well, we still get those 2 ATP. Remember, glycolysis didn't need oxygen, so you're still making some ATP, but not very much. But now you've got a bunch of pyruvate that's built up, and it can't go down the aerobic pathway, so you have to get rid of that pyruvate somehow, and you do it through the act of fermentation. Now, one of the products that you can get out of fermentation is alcohol, right? And that's what when you're using yeast to brew beer. One of the byproducts of them going through fermentation is the creation of alcohol. But a similar process happens in your body too. When you're going out for a jog and you're, kind of huffing and puffing, you're doing aerobic respiration. But if you start pushing your body so hard that your muscles are actually starting to burn, you know what I'm talking about, when you work out to the point where your muscles are just totally burning and you are huffing and puffing and your body just can't get enough oxygen into those muscle cells. So your muscle cells start undergoing a form of anaerobic respiration. It's also a form of fermentation. Of course, we're not making alcohol in your cells. Instead, you're making a different substance called lactic acid. So lactic acid is actually the byproduct of aerobic respiration occurring in your muscle cells. So here's kind of what that pathway looks like. Remember glycolysis, right? Glycolysis makes 2 ATP, and it also makes 2 NADHs. Wonderful. But the pyruvate can't continue on. So the pyruvate actually gets broken down, and the NADH then gets reduced down, and the byproduct is ethanol. Okay? Now, what did you make in the end? Well, you made a couple ATP, and you made a little bit of ethanol as the byproduct. All right, no problem. Now, so step 2 actually requires that you burn that NADH, which otherwise would have gone into the electron transport chain if you were going down the aerobic pathway, right? So it oxidizes NADH and it reduces it down it oxidizes it down to NAD+. So your byproducts here are alcohol and CO2. So have you guys ever used yeast to make bread? And what does the yeast do? It causes the dough to rise. Well, it's rising because it's pumping out CO2 into the bread. Why? Because it's undergoing a form of fermentation. Okay? Now, we also do this on purpose using yeasts, right? Well, at least some of us do or have. This is what we do when we're brewing beer. So yeast is a single-celled fungi, and when we're making bread or making alcohol, we're telling that yeast, and yeast, by the way, cannot do aerobic respiration. They can only do anaerobic. So they're only doing glycolysis, not the other steps involved in aerobic. So they are making a little bit of ATP. So you start off with glucose, and you're burning a little bit of ATP, but you're making a net of 2 ATP. Of course, you're also making a little bit of alcohol too. Yeah, and here's Prince Charles. He bloody loves yeast because it makes beer. Yay, we love beer. Anyway, okay, that's what's going on in yeast, but obviously that doesn't happen in humans, right? When you starve your cells of oxygen, that is when your muscle cells are not getting enough oxygen, then you temporarily revert to a form of anaerobic fermentation. And except in our case, the process is still the same. You end up with 2-pyruvate. Yes, you're still burning your NADH that you made here, but instead of alcohol being the outcome, it's lactic acid or lactate. And you know it well because when that stuff builds up in your muscles, lactate, it burns for a few days and you get sore muscles. Okay? So this is just a real nice summary of the anaerobic respiration pathways. You're still starting out with a glucose, you're spending 2 ATP, you make 4 ATP, so for a net of 2, right? But in the process, depending on who you are, you're either making bread or making alcohol, or if you are an animal, you're making lactate. Okay? So that kind of summarizes it all there. Now, what about storing sugars? When you're eating bread, obviously you're burning that, but your body actually is able to store some sugars, and it stores it in the form of glycogen. Glycogen is, and we mentioned this actually in the macromolecule lecture, is the main carbohydrate storage medium in animals. And when ATP levels are really high, that is, you've got plenty of energy in your body, well then any glucose that is in your body simply stores it in the form of glycogen in your liver and to some degree in your muscles too. And when your blood sugar actually, or when your blood glucose levels begin to decline and you begin to need more ATP production, well then your body converts that glycogen back to glucose, releasing it into the blood where it can then enter the aerobic respiration pathways. Okay, now we've talked a lot about carbohydrates, but what about fats and even proteins? Can't you burn those and make ATP? The answer is yes. Yes, you can. It's just that they enter the respiration cycle at slightly different areas. So you get a little bit more ATP when you're burning a glucose molecule, but you still get a fair amount of ATP when you're burning fats or even proteins. So if you have too much carbs, and they basically totally filled up your glycogen and you're storing it all in your liver, well then eventually it can get converted to fats. And speaking of fats, I'm looking here at this wonderful cake. Yep, that's actually my wedding cake. We had a pretty awesome wedding cake, don't you agree? So you end up burning your reserves, your fat reserves, and your glycogen reserves. Glycogen is only about 1% of your body's reserves. That's the stuff that you use up really, really quickly. Proteins are only about 21% of your energy reserves, but fats can be 78% of your energy reserves. So energy from fats, let's talk about that. You can actually break down your fats into their constituent parts. Remember back to the macromolecule lectures, think about triglycerides, right? you can break those triglycerides into its glycerol backbone and the fatty acids, and both of those can get converted through the act of glycolysis. But they enter glycolysis and the Krebs cycle kind of simultaneously, so you don't get a huge number of ATP out. But from your perspective, if you're exercising, it's a really good way to burn off those extra calories, those extra fats. So in steady, prolonged exercise, half of the ATP that your body is generating can come from the fats that you're storing in your body. Same thing with proteins too. If you are starving, for example, let's say you haven't had food for an entire week, you've already long since burned through your glycogen stores. You've already begun to burn pretty much all of your fat reserves. Well, now you have no choice but to begin burning proteins. And it is possible to get energy out to make ATP by actually breaking down your amino acids. I don't recommend going to this extreme because then you're really messing with your body's health. But breaking amino acids apart can be used in the respiration process. Amino acid groups then get removed, and that stuff gets converted to urea, and that's the stuff that's in your urine. So your pee is actually very nitrogen rich, and those nitrogen sources are usually from the proteins that you eat. So if you are eating an inordinate amount of proteins, like more proteins than you need, that extra protein, those amino groups are actually, or the ammonia groups in those amines, you're just peeing them out. So it's not like you're storing extra proteins, you're just peeing all that extra protein out. So, but, those carbon backbones that you get out of the amino acids, they don't enter from the beginning. They don't enter from glycolysis, but they will enter at a step in citric acid. So you're still going to get some ATP formation there. This is kind of a nice little chart that demonstrates where each of these different macromolecules enters during the entire respiration process. Starting in the middle, carbohydrates, well, these ultimately lead to glucose, and glucose enters at the very beginning of glycolysis, where you get all 36 to 38 ATP. If you're burning fats, well, the glycerols enter in glycolysis, but the fatty acids don't enter until the beginning of citric acid. So yeah, you're still getting ATP, just not as many as if you were burning a glucose. Same thing here with amino acids. Amino acids are going to be entering at different stages too. They're going to enter either at some stage in glycolysis, or just before citric acid cycle, or at some stage within citric acid cycle. So again, with proteins, you're not generating as many ATP as if you had just started with a single glucose molecule. Okay, you guys ready for a pop quiz? You ready? What is the first stage of respiration? What is it, you guys? You got it. If you guess glycolysis, then you're going to get that question right on the midterm exam. Okay, that is it for this particular lecture. We are done with metabolism, and I will see you all in cyberspace in the next lecture.